I used to enjoy this section of the magazine more than any other.
It was the best and most well-regarded section of the National Review.
Yes. Where he'd respond to letters. And wonderful responses. Well, one lady was so upset by his use of the word damn that she wrote indignantly saying, please cancel my subscription. And he replied, cancel your own damn subscription.
That
You
back.
just swing that mic closer.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
There we go. Like
And yes, and then take the actual mic itself and then turn the roundest part towards you. There you
Okay.
go. Yeah, and then just bring it a little bit closer to your face.
Without eating it.
Yeah, without eating it.
All right.
Yes.
I did always, as a kid, I thought of colored microphones with the square boxes for NFL announcements was actual ice cream, and I
Oh.
couldn't figure out why they weren't eating
Why
it.
they were
obviously-
not
I was
licking
like,
the mic.
that's, I'll take it.
Some sort of heroic sacrifice.
Yeah.
Yes, in order to tell you why the winning team is pointing more scores than
Yes.
the other team, which is pointing less scores.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Well, why is that team losing? Well, they're pointing less.
Just in general. I was trying to watch the Pope's inaugural mass.
Mm.
Some very beautiful music. Could I listen to the music? No. Because the commentators, they're like fish. A fish dies if it stops swimming. The commentators must think that they'll die if they stop talking.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Instead of letting us listen to very beautiful music, blah, 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 blah.
Right. Saying things that most likely the audience already knew since,
And things that are less important than the music.
more importantly, the music was
People don't
better.
respect music enough.
Mhm.
It has a dignity of its own. You don't just talk through beautiful music. You shut up and let the music go.
Yes. Yes. How do you feel about your new boss?
Well, I'm very happy. I never expected an American.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone was expecting an American.
I did, ironically, that's not the right word. I did expect the name Leo. Expect is just too strong a word. But I told people, I think the new Pope, if he's smart, will pick a name like Leo.
Really?
I did.
Walk us through that a little bit.
We'll walk you through that. So I'm very proud of myself now. Yes. Someone that we both know told me that he expected to be an American. And I responded, well, I didn't expect an American, but I did predict the name Leo. So between the two of us, we make one smart man.
Right.
Uh,
We need to stick together.
yes. And again, I'm not saying that this is why he picked, the Pope picked the name Leo,
Sure.
but why I thought Leo would be a good name. I thought that what the church, I thought and think, and here I distance myself from strong traditionalists and from progressives. Distance myself from both. Why not have everybody hate me?
Why not be homeless?
That's right. So I think what the church, I am convinced of this, the church has a need at this moment in history, 2025, 60 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council, the church has a need to turn the page without ripping it out of the book. That's my metaphor. Turn the page without ripping it out of the book. So the need to exit the Vatican II era without trying to abolish it or pretend that it didn't happen.
I see.
To embrace the Second Vatican Council as part of the church's tradition, but also to embed it in in the church's tradition. So it is not, I remember voting against this even as a kid in the 80s. Shows how old I am. We had film strips in those days, and we had a film strip present. Those were a little antiquated even in the early 80s. We had a film strip presentation about the Second Vatican Council. No Pentecost. And as a kid, I thought to myself, what the hell? You only get one Pentecost. It's not like the Holy Spirit has to say, well, this hasn't worked. We're going to start over again. It's not a new Pentecost. It is an important event in the church's ongoing development, but it is not the summit of that development, and it's not the start of a whole new life for the church. It's a continuation of an ancient tradition. So to accept the Second Vatican Council as part of the church's tradition, to embed it in that tradition, and then to move on. We're no longer in the era of implementing the council. We're in a new era, not trying to put the council back in a box, but trying to move on to the needs of our day and age. It seems to me that the needs of our day and age are to a great degree uh, summed up by saying a return to tradition, to things of enduring value, things that connect us with the deep past, not things that just started yesterday. Vatican II is part of that. It's part of that tradition, but doesn't sum it all up. So with that in mind, I thought choice of name. You need a name that won't say to anyone, we're going against the Second Vatican Council. That won't
What's an example of that sort of name?
13th.
Ah,
That won't say to anyone, we're going to continue trying to implement the council. You know, you said John the 24th or Paul the 7th or even John Paul the 3rd. You know, if you haven't implemented it successfully in 60 years, you're not going to. I think we can say it has been successfully implemented as much as any council in the church's history. And it's time to move on with that as part of our tradition. And a way to say that is to choose a name from way before, century before almost, the Vatican II era. I thought Leo would be a good name, not snatched from the distant past, such that people are innocent, what on earth, but far enough in the past that it's not taking sides in that traditionalist versus progressive dichotomy that's hurting us. I mean, it is hurting us. The one group trying to put the council back in a box, the other group trying to say that we're still trying to move into the future envisioned 60 years ago. It doesn't speak to the world today as a contemporary event, part of our tradition, but it's no longer a contemporary event. And we shouldn't pretend that it is.
so you're actually here saying that in a certain way, both parties in the church are stuck in the past.
Yes,
You are going to be homeless.
I'm going to be homeless. Might as well make everybody mad.
Yeah.
At one point, here again, I'm okay. And you know, I have not had a sip. I have not had a sip of this nice bourbon.
It is a nice bourbon.
Although I'm so without any alcoholic influence, I'm going to put myself out on a limb. At one point, Pope Francis, rest his soul, criticized traditionalists as being nostalgic. I dare say there was some truth to that, but he missed the fact that in many ways he was nostalgic. That for him, the Second Vatican Council was what, to steal a line from Wordsworth, describing his youthful response to the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And to some extent, he was nostalgic about that youthful experience of the council and wanted to recapture that experience. It wasn't going to be recaptured. It is, in the most literal sense, history, important history, but history. It's no longer a contemporary event. It's part of our tradition, has to be respected as part of our tradition. We're no longer in that era. We need to move on.
You think that in a certain way, the error that the late Pope made was to try to imbue everyone with the feeling that he had as a younger man.
I'm afraid so.
Like, oh, I was so excited at this place in the world, at this place in my own lifetime with these specific events.
I think so.
I want to spread that feeling,
I think so.
which actually was probably a fairly pious feeling. And
In a nostalgic kind of way,
In
it
a
was a massive exercise in nostalgia. One of the
Okay.
more telling remarks he made was jokingly saying the next pope will be John the 24th. But that's telling. It's going to be recaptured. We're going to do this again. We're going to have this excitement that so fired my youth. But that's part of history. Your youth is part of history. The council itself is part of history, not to be repudiated. I want to emphasize that. Not to be repudiated, to be accepted as part of our tradition. But we're no longer in that era. And to try and rekindle that era is unhelpful nostalgia. He used that word of traditionalist, but I think if I can say this respectfully, rest his soul, I think he was extremely nostalgic himself.
Whoa.
Just nostalgic from a different perspective.
Right.
Bliss was it in that time to be alive, but to be young as he was in those days. What, born 1938? To be young was very heaven.
Mm.
But that
And yet all such experiences are always ephemeral.
exactly necessarily.
That might be what gives them some of their sweetness.
That's precisely what gives them their sweetness, like your youth. And you can think back in it with a healthy kind of nostalgia. But it's sad if you try to keep reliving your youth.
Yes. Yes. It's as if it displays a belief that actually things can't get better,
Exactly.
or that different things can't be good in their own way.
In their own way.
Right. Even though they are going to be different. Okay. What do the previous Leos give the church? There are a lot.
Leos.
Yeah. So what can we learn from that? What are some other notable Leos?
I mean, well, of course, Leo the Great.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason he was called Leo the Great.
Uh-huh.
One historian said, you're almost a pope at a time when the Roman Empire in the West was falling apart. One historian said he was the one strong man on the scene in the West. Another historian said, you almost find yourself regretting that he couldn't be Roman emperor instead of pope. From our perspective, he had a more important job as pope, but he would have been supremely capable. He's one of those men who would have been extremely capable in any position in which you put them.
Hmm.
He was just good. Calm, brave, highly intelligent, level-headed, humble enough, but not humble in the sense of timid or retiring. He was someone who could volunteer to lead negotiations with Attila the Hun.
He was the one who rode out
Yes.
with a small party
Yeah,
to meet
as a negotiator.
the worst threat that Rome had seen in 2 or 3 generations.
Yes. A slightly chastened threat, to be fair. Previously, Attila had launched an invasion of Gaul, and at the huge Battle of Chalons, been defeated by what forces the Roman commander, subsequently murdered by a silly emperor, by what forces the Roman commander in Gaul could muster,
Could cobble together.
but they defeated Attila. So by the time he invaded Italy, he was somewhat chastened. Nonetheless, his invasion of Italy was nasty.
That particular Roman commander was not able to be there in central Italy
He was not.
Okay.
By that time, the Roman Empire, well, that's an interesting question, by the way. There's always be careful to avoid going off into certain rabbit holes.
No. Let's go down. I will pull you back out.
Fascinating to me to look at the official list we have of Roman military units in the Notitia Dignitatum, and then compare that with the number of troops the Romans were actually able to deploy operationally at this stage in the West. To a great degree, the Roman army in the West existed on paper.
Mm-hmm.
So it could no longer defend Africa, Gaul, and Italy at the same time. It totally given up on Britain by this stage. Half given up on Spain. Can no longer defend Gaul, Italy, and Africa at the same time. So it wasn't helpless, but it was not commanding. And in that situation of chaos, political chaos, very weak emperor in the West, the one man able to step forward and negotiate was Pope Leo, who had other things on his plate, like the Council of Chalcedon, and a fierce theological debate about the person of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. What do we say about Christ? Do we say we believe in him? What do we say about him? Who is he? No more important question than that. At the Council of Ephesus and now the Council of Chalcedon we're dealing with, Pope had a lot on his plate. The ongoing Pelagian controversy. Nonetheless, okay, I'm going to put aside some unpope things just for a moment and go talk to the much feared Attila the Hun. And he is the man to do it.
Because there's no one else to do it.
No one else to do it. Like I said, that's
The
maybe.
Roman army around Rome had collapsed or just wasn't even really in existence in the first place.
I mentioned that discrepancy between the on paper strength
Uh-huh.
and actual strength. As far as I can tell, they're in a position in which the they could only maintain one field force in the West, only one field force, and that field force was in Gaul,
Ah,
which meant that the strategy in Italy was to hold the fortified positions, bring in the crops, and let Attila and his boys go hungry until they're willing to be reasonable. Perhaps more reasonable because they'd gotten a good punch in the face the year before at the Battle of Chalon.
uh-huh.
But it's very striking that the man to conduct the negotiations with Pope Leo, there was no one in the imperial government to do it.
The emperor had just abdicated or fled
No,
Rome.
well, emperors had not lived in Rome for a long time by this
Right.
stage, long time. The emperor was ensconced in Ravenna, an impregnable fortress, and he was pretty useless as an emperor.
Hmm.
Eventually, he would be persuaded to kill personally himself, not order the execution of, but personally himself murder General Aetius, who had won the battle
Jeez.
in Gaul, personally murdered him, uh, which led two former members of Aetius' bodyguard to murder the emperor. This is after the
All
adventure,
in the same incident or
a little later.
a little later? Okay, so they came for revenge.
Yes, after the time that Attila was sent on his way.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so he was murdered. A wealthy senator in Rome decided to promote himself to emperor, but no one believed in him. And that was the moment when Gesseric, the Vandal, who had seized Roman Africa, decided to sail to Rome
Jeez.
and sack Rome. The absurd Petronius Maximus, Minimus really, was lynched by an irritated crowd. And the only person to deal with Gesseric as he came to sack Rome was Pope Leo,
Pope Leo.
who was not able to convince him. He was not able to convince Gesseric not to sack Rome, but was able to work out arrangements for it to be, if this isn't too oxymoronic, an organized sack.
And a polite sacking.
An sacking. An organized sacking. Not just running wild in the streets.
Huh. What did Leo hold as cards to convince these other generals to step
Well,
more carefully? What was he offering?
well, the thing with Attila, he was able, again, we don't know, right? It's not like we have a transcript of the conversation.
Ah, of course.
But the
And
guess
though most likely they would have been conducting the conversation in Latin.
had to have been in Latin.
Okay.
It's doubtful that it's, that's an interesting question, but it's doubtful that Attila spoke Latin. Uh, Gesseric probably did. By that time, the Vandals had been in contact with Rome for long enough. It's just possible that Attila did, but if he did, not very comfortably. But he had people who could help him with Latin.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we happen to possess a detailed account of an Eastern Roman diplomatic delegation to Attila's headquarters. It's just fascinating reading. Anyway, we don't have a transcript, but the guess is he's said something to Attila on the lines of, "We know your army hasn't entirely recovered from the beating it took last year." Find a polite way to say that. You've done some sacking in Italy, but your army's beginning to run hungry, you'll have to admit. It's hard for you to sit still in besieged places. That's kind of a rule for ancient medieval history, by the way.
Mm.
Armies that sat still to besieged spaces began to run hungry themselves, and began to suffer from disease, particularly dysentery. I mean, camps would get filthy. So your army's hurting. Maybe you might want to leave, and if it will help you leave, here's some cash. That's the guess.
That's the guess.
Attila left, got married yet again. Apparently, there are some people like conspiracy theories who think this is a cover story, but apparently Attila, after celebrating his wedding, passed out, severely drunk, had a hemorrhage in his nose, and drowned in his blood.
At his own wedding.
Ah,
Jeez.
us.
Huh.
How's that for wrath of God?
That is the wrath of God.
Gesseric, however, did not come to such an end.
No. Gesseric, you said? Or
Gesseric,
Gaiseric.
King of the his official title, King of the Vandals and the Alans.
Mm-hmm.
Vandals, a Germanic tribe or Germanic group. The Alans, a more or less Iranian group,
Mm-hmm.
adrift in the western part of the Roman Empire as a military force, probably attracting all sorts of people, flotsam and jetsam from other nationalities, but running amok.
Mm-hmm.
Able to run amok because, as I said, at this point, the empire in the west was
Had one field
had
army,
one field army,
and that was in Gaul.
and that was in Gaul.
Huh. Wow.
And Pope Leo had so many other things to consider.
Hmm.
It's likely that on one of the many things that he had to deal with was some controversy about a bishop in Ireland named Patrick. So he had a lot to take care of,
He had a lot on his plate.
and he stood up to it all.
Right. He never really cracked.
Did not.
Oh.
And in the midst of all this, he had the time to write brilliant sermons
Uh-huh. Wow.
that are still part of the breviary readings.
Wow.
Every Christmas Eve, one of his Christmas sermons, part of the office of reading. It's very beautiful and theologically deep.
Mm-hmm.
He had an ability to take important theological concepts and express them in very concise and precise Latin. So for the Council of Chalcedon, he wrote his famous tome, and we hear the word tome, and we think a big book, but no, it was a very brief instruction about what the council needs to conclude. It was one of the high marks of papal authority in the history of the church. He wrote to the Council of Chalcedon, "This is what you need to say," and that's what the council said.
You need to say this and flesh it out as you see fit.
Yes.
But you need to say this.
You need to say that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is one person in whom true human nature and the divine nature are united without being mixed, but are inseparably united. He is a divine person, the second person of the Holy Trinity who truly assumed a human nature.
Hmm. So one person
One
and
person,
two
and
natures.
two natures. Very succinct, very precise Latin. And he told the Council of Chalcedon, "This is what you need to say." And the council was so impressed that famous exclamation from members of the council, "Peter has spoken through Leo."
Hmm.
One of the high points of papal authority in the history of the church.
Interesting. I want to come back to papal authority, but
That's Leo the First.
Yeah, that's Leo the First. Other
Third
Leo the Third. All right.
Had a harder time, Leo the Third, but he stands as someone who's able to say a new era has actually begun in Italy. The old Roman Empire is gone. The new power is the Frankish power. So the
Which
king
would
of,
have found its seat in Paris.
interesting question. The heartland for the Franks was between the Rhine and maybe Paris was on one edge of their heartland.
Okay.
And you can think of, say, like Cologne being on the other edge. In between was a place like Aachen, where Charlemagne built his palace. So it was the heartland between the Rhine and the Seine rivers,
Okay.
which is why Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, was claimed by the French and the Germans
Mm-hmm.
with good reason. Obviously, France comes from the Franks, but the Frankish language, the language the Franks spoke, was ancestral to German,
Okay.
uh, ancestral to one strain of German.
Sure.
Uh,
If we heard it today, we would think it was a very guttural German.
yeah, it probably would have sounded, oh gee, might have sounded a little like Dutch.
Okay.
I have an idea what it sounded like, because the time of Charlemagne's grandchildren, there was a treaty that was affirmed in both the Franco-Roman language and what they call it. The one language was called Lingua Romana Rustica. So whatever they were speaking, what was becoming France, it wasn't Latin anymore. It
Mm-hmm.
was clearly related to Latin, so Lingua Romana Rustica. And the other language was Lingua Tedesca, uh, which would be an early form of Deutsch.
Ah,
Uh, Probably kind of Low German. Anyway, that Leo III is able to recognize that this is the power
the moment.
of the moment. And if we're going to have law and order in the West, this is the power to work with. He followed other popes in doing this. He took it one step further, famously crowning Charles Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in 800.
Ah,
Leo III is deeply controversial in Rome, and we don't know why. Our sources don't reveal why some people in Rome so deeply disliked him.
okay.
But at one point, Charlemagne had to intervene in Rome because he'd been attacked and kidnapped, liberated from his kidnappers before they're able to complete the process of ripping out his tongue. Uh, so Leo suffered quite a bit, deeply controversial in Rome, and we don't.
Ah,
But he fought a line of popes in that historic realignment. And it was historic. Not rejecting the East Roman Empire, it centered in New Rome, Constantinople to us, Istanbul.
mm-hmm.
Not rejecting it, but recognizing that
They're far away.
they're far away and intermittently heretical with the iconoclasts. On the other hand, nearby, we have this new power that has unified the lands that had been Gaul, the lands that had been Germania, that defeated the Lombards in Italy. Uh, if there is an empire in the West, this is it.
Mm-hmm. And Rome is no longer going to be the axis of European life.
I'd been for quite a while.
Okay.
First hadn't lived in Rome for a long time. It was ceremonially important to the empire. It was more important as a center now for Christianity. So we have from St. Columban a somewhat impertinent letter to Pope Boniface IV. This is earlier, a century earlier. Uh, but in that letter, he talks about how we in Ireland we've never revered Rome because of the Caesars. We revere Rome because of Peter and Paul.
Ah,
But for the bishops of Rome, there was an enduring alliance between the idea of Roman Empire and the Rome of Peter and Paul, an
mm-hmm.
enduring alliance. It was hard for them to say that the Roman Empire was gone. How do you answer the question, when did the Roman Empire end? It's almost impossible to answer.
Ah, it's not just 476 AD. Ugh.
That
Such a canned answer.
very few people at the time recognized as important. Something political happened in that year,
Yep.
but very few people thought, oh, now the Roman Empire's gone. No.
Which was what, the abdication of Augustus Romulus?
When forced abdication,
Hmm.
but he probably wasn't, he was not recognized by the East anyway. Uh, had little real power anyway. At least in Italy, the government continued anyway. So,
Right. No one said, oh, this is it.
right.
It's over.
Even as late as 800, to say that the Roman Empire was over, this was not obvious to people in Italy.
I remember this image that we had in some, right, like middle school book about the Roman Empire. And the last page is about the fall of the Roman Empire. And there's some dirty, tattered, poor centurion
Oh
running.
my, very dramatic.
Yeah, exactly. Very dramatic. Coming to the crest of a hill and looking back at some Roman settlement in flames with barbarians running amok.
My.
And like the implication is that centurion knew, oh, this is it. This is the end.
And in some places, there was a moment like that.
Okay.
In other places, hmm, we have the life of Saint Severus of Noricum. Noricum, what's now Austria.
Hmm.
It's a life of a saint, written by a contemporary, in the next generation anyway. His purpose is not to illustrate the collapse of the Roman Empire along the Danube River, but incidentally, it does. It talks about how Saint Severinus of Noricum talks about how he had to deal with various warlords. And there's a really interesting vignette where one detachment of Roman troops hadn't received pay for a while. And they send some men to collect the pay. And the men never make it back. Turns out they were murdered on the way. But that little vignette, the other vignettes like that, they show how in remoter areas, the empire definitely disappeared, but not with a bang. More like a series of whimpers along the way.
Mm-hmm.
In other places, Italy in particular, but to a lesser extent, Gaul, it wasn't so obvious that it was gone. In some way, Roman law continued. Britain, Roman government completely collapsed. Cities completely collapsed. Interesting case. Not in Gaul, certainly not in Italy. And as the Franks, really by sheer muscle, one group, one dynasty made itself king of all the Franks. The Franks made themselves rulers of all of Gaul and had what had been Roman Germania, just sheer muscle. And at one point, decisively, this muscle decided that it was going to be very, very Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened at precisely the moment when the popes were having to deal with an East Roman Empire that was unable to defend Rome.
Yep.
It's a big deal if you're Pope. You want Rome defended. Unable to defend Rome. Unable to establish law and order in Italy. And dabbling in heresy. The iconoclast controversy.
Top it off.
So it didn't happen in a moment. It was a succession of popes that little by little began to change their axis from looking to East Rome to looking north.
Mm-hmm.
But that process is complete with Leo III.
With Leo III. Okay. We are now aligned towards the Holy Roman Empire.
Exactly. I talk a lot. I did a presentation with our called the Catacomb Club in Powell. So the basement of the church, that's the catacomb part.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a got a dual religious education program for teens. So one leg of it is more conventional. The less conventional leg is they come down to this basement room and some candles are lit. There's some recorded Gregorian chant playing to sort of set the mood. We have some prayers and someone does a presentation about a saint. And then there's time for them to respond to that presentation. I picked Pope Leo IX, Pope of the 11th century. And the church reform of the 11th century actually began in the 10th century, not with the popes, it began with monasteries, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly the great monastery of Cluny in France. Largest church in Christendom until the building of St. Peter's. And the French Revolution demolished it, except for one transept. And even that one transept is pretty impressive. Anyway,
Why?
because the French Revolution introduced the concept of cancel culture. Actually, the Reformation introduced that, but the French Revolution pursued it with particular fanaticism. We're going to burn the statues of the kings. We're going to destroy their bodies. We're going to burn their corpses. We're going to trash the relics of the saints. We're going to abolish the whole past because a great new future has opened up. In fact, we're not even going to do AD anymore. We're going to date everything from the first year of the revolution that is remaking humanity. And to quote Wordsworth again, for a lot of people, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. If you could overlook lots of guillotinings and ensuing 23 years of nonstop war, which
Yes.
France, by the way, eventually lost, and yet they still celebrate Bastille Day. But that's off the subject.
That is tangential to the,
So
yeah.
Leo the Ninth took the reform movement and put the papacy at the head of it. This is crucial. The papacy was emerging with the help of the Germano-Roman emperors, was emerging from what had been called the pornocracy of
That's a
Run,
thing.
run that line.
The-
Yeah. The pornocracy.
pornocracy. So the absolute bottom of the whole history of the papacy was in the 11th century. When, after the death of Otto III, there was no longer a strong German hand guiding Rome. The popes were left at the mercy of the various Roman warlords, various Roman families, you might say, but that sounds too mafia-ish, but you get the idea. The papacy at the mercy of the various Roman families, and it was bad. How to break out of it? Well, the only man to break the papacy free from that was another Germano-Roman emperor, Henry III, but he broke it free with a very humiliating episode, the Council of Sutri, where he had two claimants to the papal throne, and he just said, "You're under arrest. You're under arrest. I'm picking a new pope." Deeply humiliating. And
To the papacy.
yes, to the papacy. And there was no real future that way. And for the church in the long run, that would be a disaster. For the church to be just an adjunct to the Germano-Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. The religious arm of the.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
For the whole church to be what the church in the empire was, the Reichskirche, very much at the service of the Reich. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. It was integral to the Reich constitution. But for the whole church to be merely part of the Reich constitution, this would not do. There was already a reform movement underway. What was needed was for the papacy to assume leadership of that reform movement. And Leo IX did that. He was picked by the emperor. He was a pope from the north, bilingual, speaking French and German.
Mm-hmm.
Bishop of Toul, which is now part of France, but sits in that zone where historically France and Germany somewhat overlap. Many of my ancestors from that zone, by the way. Alsace and Lorraine.
So this region of the world is not definitely German, but neither is it definitely French.
It's not French the way that Normandy is.
Mm-hmm.
It's French politically, but with a twist.
Okay.
And at times, part of it has been German politically. Sensitive issue, but it's not simply German. It's not simply French. It's very distinctive. It's produced some great French patriots. Joan of Arc was from that region.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also produced some notable German figures. It produced Leo IX, Bruno of Toul, who took the name Leo as Pope, picked by the emperor, but he embarked on a new path, that the papacy would take leadership of the reform movement. How did he do that? He went on the road, very literally on the road. This is a new and startling thing in the middle 11th century, to have the Pope show up in France.
Right.
And gather a local collection.
This is not when travel was pleasant.
It was not easy to do. In fact, one reason he died early, he wore himself out physically.
Oh.
As he traveled through Italy and France. And that his native region as well, that was part of the German Empire, the Germano-Roman Empire, but bilingual, traveled throughout France, throughout that region, throughout Italy, wore himself out, but appeared at local councils, summoned local councils, and had these local councils embrace church reform, which meant going back to basics. Church reform was returning to our roots, enforcing laws that had been ignored for too long. Like, no, you cannot buy church office. It had been normal. So normal that nobody thought of it as illegal. If the king is going to appoint you, basically the king would appoint you and then invest you in the office. The king wouldn't ordain you. That had to be done by bishops, but the king would appoint you. The king or the emperor would appoint you as bishop or abbot. He'd invest you with your staff and your ring. And of course, you'd pay him some money for that. That would be expected. No, you can no longer purchase church office. Yes, as a matter of fact, the old law of celibacy for priests is still the law. And we're going to start enforcing it.
We're going to start being enthusiastic about it again.
Yes. We're going to see the spiritual value of it. Yes, enthusiastic about it. We're going to enforce it. It hadn't been enforced for so long that nobody regarded it as law anymore.
So priests were marrying, or they were just having like concubines?
They're marrying.
Okay.
Well, there's a time in history also when marriage was much less formal than it later become. So another
This reform was long overdue.
Terribly long overdue. Another item in that reform was insisting on actual Christian marriage for Christians, which had been on the book, but had been ignored for a very long time.
So people were essentially taking like common law
Basically,
spouses.
Yes, what another generation would call common law. And in effect, because church law, and Leo didn't live long enough to address this. It was a long-term project. But church law was about forbidden degrees of relationship was so convoluted that you almost couldn't marry anyone who was at all a cousin. Well, the nobility of Europe, they were all cousins to each other, which meant it was very common practice. If you wanted to get a divorce, you would just say, "Oh, I just discovered I married to one of my cousins." And
it was a farce.
The obedient bishops would duly grant you an annulment because the marriage was within forbidden degrees of relationship.
Which it was.
But it was a ridiculously complex law. Now, that wasn't definitively addressed until the time of the great Innocent III. This church reform movement took some time and ran into some huge turmoil along the way.
Because there would have been resistance.
Yes. Oh, sometimes vehement resistance, like the Archbishop of Rouen, who had to flee his cathedral to avoid getting lynched by priest wives.
Wow.
Yes, he decided they were going to call cold turkey on the celibacy thing, and the wives didn't respond well to that.
I'm sure they didn't.
The current, at the time, Abbot of Bec, later Archbishop Lanfric of Canterbury, learned from that experience. So he said, "We're going to have a grandfather clause here.
No new marriages for priests."
And then, of course, the whole investiture controversy, which exploded after Leo's time. So emperor, king would basically pick the bishop or abbot, invest them with their staff and ring.
Yeah.
That had to be confronted. That was after Leo's time. He was just addressing the first, most urgent issue of simony, the purchase of these offices. But he got the church reform. It had already begun in the monasteries, but he took papal leadership of it and put it on the front of the church's agenda.
Yep.
With tremendously important consequences long after his lifetime. So Leo IX is on my list.
Okay, so Leo, let's just make sure we're tracking. So Leo the First.
Leo the Great, Leo the First. Leo the Third. Multi-talented, Leo the Third.
Kept Rome standing.
That's right.
Leo the Third recognized that the papacy and the church in the West needed to be realigned
north rather than east.
Okay, and then Leo the Ninth said,
took papal leadership of the reform movement.
Okay.
He had so many problems to deal with. He's a cameo figure in one of my board games, actually.
Oh, really?
The Battle of Civitate. The enormously energetic Normans, not under the leadership of their duke. Under the leadership of their duke, they would later conquer England.
That's William III,
William the Conqueror,
William the
the
Conqueror,
first.
the first.
But
Okay.
another group of Normans, not under the leadership of their duke, had set themselves up. It's kind of like the Clint Eastwood character in A Fistful of Dollars. In southern Italy, there was a conflict between the Greco-Roman Empire and the Lombards. These Normans came as mercenaries, and as they served both sides, they realized, they're really pretty feeble compared to us.
Hmm.
Uh,
Why are we here as hired help?
when we can take over,
Right.
which they did. Under one of the most spectacular buccaneers of all history, Robert Giscard, gigantic, I'm being redundant there, gigantic, enormously physically impressive buccaneer who was one of the few buccaneers to recognize the need to go legit at one point and to make it work. He wanted to go legit. However, Pope Leo did not want this happening. If you're Bishop of Rome, you're seriously concerned about what's happening in southern Italy.
Yes.
And when he couldn't get
Sorry. Which Leo is this?
Leo the Ninth,
Leo. Okay. We're still on the ninth.
cameo in one of my war games,
Yeah.
not his best moment, he decided against the advice of the great reformer St. Peter Damian that he decided somebody has to do something about this. And both empires, the Eastern Empire, the Germano-Roman Empire, both emperors are busy with other things. I'll deal with it myself. So got together some troops, went out to deal with Robert Giscard, and got captured.
Oops.
Lost the Battle of Civitate. Robert Giscard was no simple-minded thug, however. So he wasn't going to do anything crude with the Pope, but he saw this is my chance to go legit in a big way.
Hmm.
So he said to Pope Leo, who had to be, of course, he was a prisoner, respectfully treated prisoner, but a prisoner, said to Pope Leo, you want law and order in southern Italy, right? Hello. I've got the muscle to do it. So you just recognize me as legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
I'll provide law and order in southern Italy.
So simple.
So simple, and it worked.
It worked. So what did Leo gave him some title of?
Yes. Duke of Apulia. Kind of a vague title, and there was dispute, so neither emperor was happy with this.
Hmm.
But Pope Leo, who after all had undergone a fairly traumatic experience and was shortly to die,
Uh-huh.
Pope Leo's position was,
Right. We needed law and order.
taking care of things.
Right.
I tried to take care of things one way,
Yes.
so I'm going to take care of things another way. He's tough. He's smart.
He's the best we've got.
He's the best we've got. There's going to be law and order in southern Italy.
The Duke of Apulia.
Of a Duke of Apulia.
And was that a specific region that people could point to on a map?
Yes, they could.
Okay.
It was a little bit vague, but definitely the heartland of southern Italy.
Okay.
Yeah. So cameo in one of my war games.
He shows up for one battle.
Shows up for the
Gets
battle.
captured.
Gets captured.
Okay.
That's Leo the Ninth.
That's Leo the Ninth. Wow. Okay. And now we have the present day Leo.
Yes. Well, don't forget Leo the 13th.
Ah.
One is tempted to forget Leo the 10th, of course. Leo the 10th was cluelessly presiding over the church when Martin Luther launched his revolt.
A better man could have headed it off, huh?
Leo the 10th is not the man. He quite literally did not know what Luther was talking about. So one historian talked about this. Leo the 10th, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. And one historian looked at, we know what his education was. And one historian looked at his education. It was a classic Italian Renaissance education. Classic Italian Renaissance education did not prepare him for a religious revival run amok.
Uh-huh.
And Luther was dealing with emotions that were alien to Leo. And Luther, with his scholastic background, even though Luther rejected his scholastic background, he was operating in an intellectual world that was unfamiliar to Leo.
So Leo, you said had a classical,
Classic Italian Renaissance education.
so not classical, right?
Oh, very classical. He
Very
knew
class.
Virgil. He
Okay.
knew Livy.
Okay.
His Latin was elegant.
Okay. So who did he not know?
We didn't
That
know St. Paul that
he,
well.
ah,
In
okay.
particular, he didn't know St. Augustine very well.
Okay.
Uh, in a lot of ways, Leo X illustrates the limitations of the Italian Renaissance.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay. So there would have been a familiarity with poetry and literature
yes,
that was not matched by his knowledge of the doctrines of the church or scripture.
exactly. He did
Ah,
not have the right formation to be pope. But in the context of Renaissance Italy, it looked like the right formation to be pope.
interesting.
Every cultural group can suffer from a certain groupthink, after all.
Hmm.
So the cardinals, mainly Italian, they were all part of this Renaissance Italian culture. He looked good, but he was incapable of dealing with what was happening north of the Alps. He had enough trouble dealing with what was happening south of the Alps, where Italy had become the wrestling mat on which Spain slash Austria and the French wrestled for dominance. Uh, and that was going to occupy a lot of Leo's attention, but he was clueless about what was happening in the north.
Okay. Was there anyone in his circles? I mean, is there anyone in Italy who did know what was going on and tried to warn him? Hey, we have an actual, real dogmatic splintering happening in Germany, or
Yes,
there was.
rapidly progressing
Mm-hmm.
from protest to complete revolution.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and Luther found himself scrambling to keep up with the revolution,
With his own movement.
his own movement.
It was getting more radical than
More
he.
radical than he had in mind.
Uh-huh.
Uh, yes, things were falling apart in Germany. Hello, Pope Leo. He had a hard time recognizing that.
Okay.
Surely, his initial response was surely this is something, some sort of obscure dispute with an Augustinian friar. So this is something the prior general of the Augustinians, which was a role that the current Pope Leo had at an earlier stage in his career. Surely this is something that the prior general of the Augustinians can deal with.
It was not.
He had no idea how deep it ran and what emotions it touched.
Because those emotions had to deal with a sense of the church taking it, exploiting its own
Exploiting Germany.
Okay.
Exploiting Germany in particular.
Ah, okay. This
Because
wasn't just about buying indulgences.
no, that's not what I mean. That was the immediate cause.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a deep-seated feeling that Germany was being exploited
By Rome.
by Rome, and that Germany didn't have a proper voice. You didn't have German cardinals, for example. Always Italian cardinals, always French cardinals. Uh, Sometimes those two groups not getting along with each other.
But they were part of the club.
They're part of the club. Sometimes English cardinals, Spanish cardinals, never Germans.
Never.
Partly because the Reichskirche was so distinctive and so integral to the Reich Constitution. Uh, so people in Rome didn't quite know how to deal with it.
Okay.
But Germany felt exploited. I didn't have a voice. A little twist on the humanist movement of the Renaissance was also discovering through Roman writers like Tacitus, discovering early Germanic resistance to the Romans. So that's part of the background too. So in Germany, not England, where it was a revolution, I argue, a revolution from above, but in Germany, it was emphatically a popular revolution.
Because finally someone is standing up to give voice to our
Someone is
frustrations.
standing up for the Germans, finally. We're not just a doormat anymore. A doormat about which people make jokes. One historian commented that chivalric manners may have been a secret weapon invented by the French to torment the Germans. All sorts of jokes about the crudeness of the Germans. There was one episode where some English nobles were captured by Spaniards in the course of the Hundred Years' War. And the chivalric historian Froissart, today we'd call him a Belgian, but part of that Frenchish, not French, but Frenchish world. He casually made the comment, the Spaniards are almost as crude as Germans. So the French, the Italians, even the English, not the Scots, but the French, the Germans, the English are part of the club. Spanish, but Germans are way out.
Germans. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So Germany was rising.
Germany was rising. Luther found himself spokesman, but then suddenly found that he had unshackled a train that he could not break.
Could not control.
Mm.
And he found it moving in ways that he did not have in mind.
Uh-huh.
He broke from the peasant rebellion in a particularly fierce way. He didn't mean to start a social revolution in Germany, but yes, the upsurge in Germany was a popular revolution in the way the Reformation in England, for example, was not.
Right.
Not to say that it didn't have popular elements, but
Sure. But in Germany, it was groundswell.
it was groundswell
And justified groundswell
to some degree.
in some ways because there had been legitimate oversight and
Germany had been taken for granted.
of course of course they'll be good pillars to the church even though we give them nothing.
Exactly.
Foolish, foolish, foolish.
Foolish. And Leo was not the man.
This was Leo X.
Leo X.
Okay.
The next notable Leo is Leo XIII, the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Elected Pope at a dark moment.
Mm.
Italy had been unified by force. Force backed
In 1870?
1870.
Yeah.
Force backed up by referendums. Even historians who ought to be a little skeptical have frequently not been. I remember reading one English historian talking about how after Italian armies conquered Rome, there was a plebiscite, and the plebiscite voted 98% for union with Italy. Well, good heavens. 20th century history shows how regimes routinely produce 95 to 100% results on plebiscites. Amazingly, the vast majority of people want what the people with the guns want. We're awfully impressed. Anyway, Italy unified largely by force. Poor Pope Pius IX resisted this ineffectually. Probably couldn't have been successfully resisted, most likely. The upswell of nationalism was too strong. Oh, Cardinal Newman preached a wonderful sermon on that, by the way. He said the Italians are going to experience what Samuel warned the Israelites about in 2 Samuel.
You have a king now.
You have a king now.
You might regret
I hope
it.
you love it. Because your king is going to be taxing you like you haven't been taxed before. And sure, you'll have a leader for your armies, you'll have a commander in chief. You ask for a king, the Lord is going to give you a king. It's not inherently evil, as I paraphrase, but your king is going to tax you like you've never been taxed before. He's going to grab your people for his service and for his wars. This is going to be a new experience for you. You need to know what you're getting into. And Cardinal Newman preached a wonderful sermon about that. He said, this new Italian state, the Italians are now going to discover what it is to pay high taxes, to support vast armies and vast navies that get sent, and they're going to have their sons die in distant wars for the sake of some politician's idea of glory. It's not going to be fun. And sure enough, it wasn't fun. But anyway, dark moment. Pope was the prisoner in the Vatican. That was the phrase. The Italian government didn't want to occupy the Vatican, but it refused to recognize the Pope as having any kind of sovereignty anymore. The Pope refused to recognize the new Italian state. It was a stalemate. At that moment, Leo XIII becomes Pope. And he has to find a way forward. First Vatican Council had met, had some sessions, and it had to disperse. Wasn't formally closed, actually, until John the 23rd called the Second Vatican Council. As part of calling it, he simultaneously officially closed the first. It was adjourned.
So technically, they were back to back.
Technically, they were back to back. Technically,
Interesting.
because it was adjourned, not closed. The decree on papal infallibility had left a lot of questions in people's minds. The debates, the bishops supported it by a strong majority, but a lot of that strong majority had some doubts about how this was going to play with other people, Protestants and seculars. Are going to sound like the Pope is claiming to be a spiritual dictator, which is how some people at least pretended to interpret it. That was the justification for Bismarck's attack on the German church, the so-called Kulturkampf. The debates were very frank, by the way, sometimes pretty ferocious. At one point, I think it was the Bishop of Little Rock, all conducted in Latin, by the way. Bishops in 1870 could function in Latin. Bishop of Little Rock, I think, gave a talk about which he said, the American Catholic Church were capable of being very loyal to the Pope without any statements about papal infallibility.
Mm-hmm.
And then an Italian bishop made a response in which he said something about how, well, the Americans, you're just too new to being Catholic. And that irritated the Bishop of Little Rock, who gave the response. As a matter of fact, I think we've got a lot more practicing Catholics proportionally in America than in Italy. At which point, remarks one historian, the discussion became very hot and very general.
Very hot and very general.
Yes.
Wow.
A very lively discussion. The bishops were candid with each other.
Hmm.
As one curial official warned John the 23rd, this council of yours, it's going to be more contentious than you realize because gatherings of bishops are not Boy Scout meetings. You've got intelligent, accomplished men with points of view and
are not in the habit of backing
not in
down.
the habit of backing down. So things will get lively. So things are
John the
lively.
23rd closed the First Vatican Council and opened the Second Vatican
Yes.
Council.
Officially closed it finally.
Died during the proceedings.
Very early on, 62 to 65, the
Okay.
council met.
And he was succeeded by Pope John Paul
VI.
Paul VI.
So Leo XIII inherited this situation,
Mhm.
uncertainty about what papal infallibility meant in practice, what Leo XIII decided, and uncertainty about how to deal with the heritage of the French Revolution,
Right.
which is tearing France apart and had effects in other countries. What Leo XIII did was he was the first pope to take, how should I put this? He didn't do a 180 from what Pope Pius IX had done with his syllabus of errors, listing all the errors, the typical errors of the modern world, which are numerous. He didn't do a 180. What he did was almost kind of a jujitsu move, you might say, not hitting the force of the opponent head on, talking about the errors, but saying, okay, got things going on in the modern world. Some of them are very good, but let's consider a little bit what a generation earlier Karl Marx had considered. Let's consider how some of these modern developments look like on the ground in the cities, the countryside too, but particularly in the cities. What's happening with the working class? Why is this new thing socialism an inherently perverse idea? He's very clear about that. But why is it getting some traction in the working class? What are we not? What is the Western world not addressing seriously enough?
What itch is it scratching?
Yes.
We're not.
And that led to Rerum Novarum, almost the founding document for Catholic social teaching, addressing the experience of the Industrial Revolution, of how the working classes in European cities felt abandoned by the old leadership of society and even felt abandoned by the church. By the churches, really plural. For famous conversation at one point in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury said to Prime Minister Disraeli, "We've lost the working classes. We have to get them back. We've lost the working classes." This, 1870s, 1880s. And Prime Minister Disraeli responded, "Your Grace, you never had them." Uh, by 1900, the majority of babies born in Berlin were not being baptized
Uh-huh.
in, historically Protestant territory. So the churches on the whole were confronted by this. What Leo did was lead the Catholic Church in at that point a unique effort to say, what does the Christian tradition, what light does the Christian tradition shine on these new modern conditions? And what lessons can we draw from shining the light of Christian tradition on these new modern conditions?
Because the world has stopped being agricultural.
Exactly.
It's now led by the city and the population in the city.
Yes. In an industrial urbanized,
Mm-hmm.
I've got a very different social situation on which the light of Christian tradition has not yet been shed
Huh.
in a systematic way.
Right.
We need to start doing that in a systematic way, hence the great encyclical Rerum Novarum,
Rerum Novarum. Wow.
which is very explicitly, from the title, very explicitly an appeal to address contemporary situations.
Sure.
And definitely Pope Leo XIV harkens back to that when he talks about addressing the challenges of AI, for example. Uh, New challenges, rerum novarum, new things, uh, from addressing those in the light of Christian tradition.
Hmm. So we always have this attention paid to an American president's administration's first 100 days. Is there something analogous in a pope's reign? I mean, is there sort of a like, oh, the first 2 years, that's sort of the proving ground. That's when they set their agenda. Like,
Truth to that,
okay.
actually. Not really the first 100 days, but I think early on, popes, as with any office, I don't mean to use this, it's not meant to be an irreverent phrase, it's kind of a honeymoon.
Yep.
When a new pope has a chance to say, to show what his signature concerns are,
Mm-hmm.
and to pursue those seriously while the atmosphere is favorable.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of John Paul II, for example, 1979, his astonishing trip to Poland. If you can imagine going to an officially atheist country, although Catholic population, but officially atheist country, hostile to the church, traveling through this hostile territory, and having hordes attend your masses. And at one point, for the people to start shouting out spontaneously in vast numbers, "We want God, we want God." Um, his famous inaugural sermon, "Be Not Afraid," which really addressed the situation of Eastern Europe in the latter days of the Cold War. It's a message for everyone, but there's a specific directionality to that. The problem of communism is concerned with other things, of course. Pope has to be. But early on, he establishes kind of a signature thing for him. He's going to confront the problem of communism. And he's going to confront it not, again, kind of a jujitsu move, not head on against communism's strength. You're evil. But talking about communism as unable to talk about the supernatural origin and supernatural destiny. So therefore, the supernatural dignity of the human person and how communism fails to recognize that and even goes against that. So not crudely aggressive, but definitely.
As in just, you're bad.
Right, but definitely aggressive. We are going on the march, and we're going to push communism back in the most fundamental way from people's hearts and people's minds.
For people to start thinking of themselves differently.
Yes.
In a way that communism doesn't allow for philosophically.
Exactly. Expose the shallowness, intellectual and moral, of the communist worldview. Its shallowness and its crudeness.
Right. Without trying to fight communism's arguments about how the poor are suffering or that there needs to be
Yes.
justice.
Hence, Pope John Paul II's ongoing concern with social justice questions. Don't leave those to the socialists, but be aware that a socialist response to those problems is worse than the problems because it directly denies the fundamental dignity of the human person, which is rooted in a supernatural origin and a supernatural destiny. And if you deny that, you reduce man to the level of an animal
Ah,
and begin to treat human beings as animals. Conversely, the great Pole Karl Wojtyła, John Paul II, and the great Russian Alexander Solzhenitsyn kind of doing the same thing. Alexander Solzhenitsyn got invited to speak, famously got invited to speak at Harvard because of his opposition to communism. But in his speech, he chastised the West in a different way, very different way, but in a different way. The West was making the same kinds of mistakes, especially the same fundamental mistake of denying the supernatural. Not as aggressive as communism did, but still denying the supernatural origin and the supernatural destiny, and therefore the supernatural dignity of the human person, reducing the human person to an animal or a machine. You see this with economists. The West was caught up in those days. It seems so juvenile today, but in those days was caught up with population crisis. Too many people. We're going to breed ourselves into extinction. This was never well supported by data. But all economists talk that way. But as one dissident economist pointed out, the problem with the mainstream view is that when a donkey is born in Peru, it considers that as adding to Peru's natural wealth. When a human being is born in Peru, they consider that as subtracting from Peru's natural wealth. The productive, even the stimulating consumptive effect of a human person, the creative effect of human persons is explicitly denied.
we just assume it's a disease.
Yes. And now we have lunatics like the man who bombed the fertility clinic in California. Of course, as Catholics, we see an ethical problem with IVF, but he bombed it because he regards having new human beings as bad. If you're totally logical, he might, anyway. Uh, he reminds me a little bit of Chesterton's quip about highly advanced philosophers who prove the excellence of their brains by blowing them out.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the West, and that was one of John Paul's points, primarily addressing communism, but also secondarily, the West in its own way is making the same mistakes, and in its own way is committing similar crimes.
So everyone needs to be reminded that this is not a struggle between the Ruskies and the Americans. That's not what this is
Exactly.
about. It's about
It's a
it's
struggle
about
for
something
the,
that everyone's losing sight of.
it's a struggle for the dignity of the human person, but that dignity is explicitly supernatural.
Mm.
And if you deny that, you make us animals, unique animals, or even machines, special machines. But you begin to treat human beings as animals or as machines.
Your philosophy will have its effects.
It will have that effect.
Yeah.
So the Leo the 13th focus on social justice, so embraced by Pius XI, so embraced by John Paul II, is inseparable from at first glance, it's inseparable from the otherworldly appeal for religious revival. True social justice cannot be separated from an awareness of a God-given dignity. And you can't be aware of a God-given dignity without being aware of God.
It's like as soon as you eliminate the potential of God, it's like humans become the worst tyrants of other humans.
Yes. That sums up Solzhenitsyn's writings. Uh, Without God, every atrocity is morally possible. And you can come up with justifications for it.
There's always some urgent problem that
Yeah,
an atrocity might fix.
exactly. The old,
If we send these people to the gallows, they'll stop oppressing us.
yes, for the
If we
greater
take,
good.
yes, if we take away these people's food, we can feed these other people who
For the
need it
greater good.
more.
And it happens. It happens. In the 1990s, uh, you got to, you saw that book I gave you about the 90s,
Ah,
that
the William
remarkable
O'Neill book.
and not entirely honest decade. Uh, the war too, places like the American West Belt, the American Rust Belt, or Northern England, the old industrial centers, the word to them was, okay, you're going to lose your jobs, your families are going to be traumatized, your communities will be destroyed, but it's all for the greater good. This is creative destruction was the phrase. And as we move into this globalized future, the fact that your local economy has collapsed, the long run, don't worry about it. Congratulations, you get to be casualties. You've been chosen for the honor of being casualties in the war for economic progress through mass globalization. Uh, Similar kind of thing. The collapse of individual communities, the traumatization of families, uh, is acceptable for the sake of the greater good. In this case, from a capitalist perspective, right? It's okay for the local industries to be wiped out and for places like Detroit to be hollowed out.
Hmm.
There's the long-term goal. We're all heading towards the future of Star Trek: The Next Generation. That was very much the mood of the 90s. We're all headed for Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Ah,
And along the way,
we won't need local communities because we're all going to space together.
yeah, along the way, some people are going to suffer, but that's creative destruction. That was the phrase.
Creative destruction. Huh.
What an oxymoron.
That's the 90s for you. It was an oxymoronic decade.
Ugh. All right, let's take a quick break.
Exactly. They didn't care if Detroit goes to hell because they don't live there.
Right. Well, and that's kind of what I was trying to tell my friends was like, look, you don't think it's bad to want to have more friends, right? No. It's like you don't think it's bad to read more books. No. It's not bad to have more music. No. So why is it bad to have more money? They could never answer. I'm like, it's just a tool. And you can use that tool for whatever good or bad end you choose, but that's up to the responsibility of the people that have that amount of property.
And those who have that tool think of themselves as members of the community.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that changes things.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, they still had us old-fashioned teachers. Still is old-fashioned already by the 70s, but old-fashioned teachers in the 70s would have us memorize lines like this is from, it's a Walter Scott line. Lives there a man with soul so dead that never to himself hath said, this is my own, my native land. I just memorized that, but it stuck with me. And those who have wealth really do identify with a land and a people, that they're part of this land, part of this people, they belong to it. And so to some degree, they put their wealth at the service of their community. But I think, again, I'm moving to my own personal opinion here. That's why I don't have my color. Moving to my own personal opinion here, but yeah, it bothers me that you have a certain kind of wealthy person who does not identify with a community or even a nation.
Mm.
Oh, I'm above all this. No. To be human is to be rooted. And you can travel around, but you need a homeland.
Your stomping grounds.
Yes. And you need a community. So, to my mind, my objection is less to wealth. I think it's absurd to object to wealth. Dear old dad, God bless him, remembers the time when he was with another, he was young. This goes way back when my dad was young. This takes us back to the 1950s. There's another group of young construction workers, and they're complaining about the rich. And one older construction worker said, "Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. All I can say is I never got hired by someone who didn't have money." Uh,
I wonder if what those people really complaining that they themselves were not the rich ones.
basically.
That's another thing. I saw this, it put it so well. It was this little video. The guy was just like, if he was Robin Hood, and he's telling people, look, I'm gonna go steal from the rich so I can give you money because you're poor. The poor people said, yay, we're gonna be rich. And it's like, what'd you just say? I think that put it so well because people automatically assume if you're poor, that's a bad thing. You know, all the globalists, all these equity, communism, socialism thing. It's so wrong that there's poor people out there. We must eradicate poor people, essentially having poor people. So we must just give them all this stuff. But we got to take it from these people who got it all and give it to them so they have it. Now it's like, now you're assuming that having stuff is better than not having stuff.
Well, you're also assuming that it's a dangerous assumption that you have the wisdom to decide how things will be distributed. Social justice does involve some social change, but I think it's a healthy instinct to rebel against against a socialist style redistribution of property. Uh, the Mexican Revolutionary Million. I am a fan of Zapata. I'm not necessarily a fan of Zapatistas, who like to use his name, but he took a stand, and a violent stand, for land reform in Mexico. In central Mexico, from the state of Morelos, in early 20th century, figure in the Mexican upheavals of the Mexican Civil War. Emiliano Zapata, uh, he took a stand for land reform. Things had developed in such a way that most of the population had no chance of owning land.
Mm.
Uh, and in that particular economy, that meant they were entirely at the mercy of the landowners. This is why there had to be land reform. We talked about this earlier, Jonathan. We land reform in Ireland, in one of the most sensible things the British government ever did. A lawful and well thought out program of land reform that would gradually and in an orderly way shift some ownership. So wasn't just big landowners who owned all the land, so the ordinary Irish could own some land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Emiliano Zapata stood for that in Mexico. Eventually, the winning side, which was theoretically a revolutionary side, found it necessary to murder Zapata because it wasn't interested in land reform. It was just interested in making life miserable for the church. But Zapata was often mistaken for a Marxist or for a socialist. And at one point, an American journalist asked him, "Are you a socialist?" And Zapata, I think he pretended not to know what a socialist is. And he asked this American journalist, "What's a socialist?" Well, a socialist is someone who believes in redistributing property. And Zapata is supposed to have said, "Well, I don't know. If somebody tried to redistribute my property, I'd redistribute some bullets from my revolver." He didn't stand for, and this is not what the peasants in Russia thought they were standing for when they joined the Russian Revolution. He didn't stand for collectivization of farming, that communist obsession.
Which never worked.
Total catastrophe. They stood for a certain redistribution because
The
too
current
many
system had corrupted.
had become very corrupt and did not allow most of the population the opportunity to have the kind of independence. That's not the right word. A certain kind of autonomy, though. That's part of having dignity. You are not entirely at the mercy of your employers. This is very different from the mindset of, say, Karl Schwab, who is capable of saying, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." This goes against human dignity. To own something that is ours, that is mine, not just lent to me, but is mine and my family's. This is to be not just a tool in the hands of some faceless, powerful people. This is to have some autonomy and dignity. Some autonomy and dignity go together. I'm not talking about a fantasy of, uh, you know, not needing anybody else, not needing the wider society, not
But
needing government. But I'm
it's some
talking
ability to say yes and no.
some go to say yes and no. You're not entirely at the mercy of others. You're not entirely at their beck and call. Uh, and I think that's one of the things that Catholic social teaching aims at. Not collectivization, whether it's communist collectivization or World Economic Forum collectivization. You can tell I'm awfully mad about that phrase. You will own nothing and be happy. Well, go to blazes, Carl.
Are you signing up to own nothing, Carl?
That's right. Why don't you be the first to own nothing, Carl? Uh, give me your jet. Uh, I'm very angry about that, as you can tell. Whether it's World Economic Forum collectivization or old style communist collectivization, it is to be rejected. Whether it's the government controlling everything or a handful of really rich people who can go private jetting to Davos controlling everything, both are to be rejected.
Because both see the human population as essentially those to be managed.
Those to be managed by the wise and the educated.
Ah, that's what Tolkien warned us about with Saruman.
Very explicitly warned us about.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. It's part of the glorious vision that lurks under Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit society. There are wealthy hobbits like Frodo and Bilbo. They're well off. They're well to do. There are poor hobbits like Sam Gamgee and his dad, the old gaffer. They are wealthier. They're all poorer, but no one is desperately poor, and no one is outrageously rich. And property ownership is widespread. That was a vision. That was Thomas Jefferson's vision for the American Republic, his yeoman vision. To a great degree, that was part of the social reality of America at the time of the Revolution. Again, at this, someone will immediately say that there were a great deal of slaves in the country. This is true. And that is a hereditas damnosa that has haunted our history, that and its after effects. Nonetheless, property ownership really was widespread. Uh, and we did have a remarkably high level of property ownership, a remarkably high standard of living by European standards at the time of the Revolution. That's what made some people in England so irritated. Do you mean to say the wealthiest people in the British Empire per capita are oppressed? Yes. We can govern ourselves. We do not need to be governed from Westminster. We can govern ourselves. Does that shock you? We can govern ourselves. We don't need to be governed from Westminster. Uh, and that, that's, I promise I'm not going to take out a flag and start waving it. But I think that's where my understanding of the American tradition at its best and my understanding of the Catholic tradition come together. That it's also summed up by Leo XIII's teaching about subsidiarity. That ordinary people can manage their affairs if you give them a chance. There needs to be coordination. There needs to be government. But ordinary people can mostly manage their affairs themselves if you give them a chance. Give them a chance. That means you have to give them a chance to have some property, to have productive work.
And you're going to have to tolerate some mistakes and some excesses.
People make mistakes, but guess what? Governments make mistakes. They do it routinely, and their mistakes tend to be more massive.
They have less consequence.
Yes, exactly. The ordinary mistakes of common people are less disastrous than the mistakes of governments.
And the people, it's on them to fix it. The government's like, oh well.
You add up the human losses of the 20th century. Ordinary crime pales before government crime. Ordinary garden variety stupidity pales before massive government stupidity.
But this was the model that, if I understand correctly, was introduced by Woodrow Wilson, that the wise are going to govern the
He
American nation.
he didn't introduce it, but he was, after all, a college professor before he became university president, before he became national president. He didn't introduce the idea, but he was definitely part of it. That he honestly believed in democracy, but his idea of democracy tended to be that the ordinary masses get to choose which of the wise will govern them and take care of those things that they obviously can't take care of themselves.
Hmm,
They get to choose their managers,
gotcha. That democracy is choosing your manager.
choosing your manager, as
You,
opposed to my idea of democracy, which I think is the older American idea of democracy, which I think is, I do think, and there's a certain brand of traditionalist that disagrees with us, as well as a certain brand of progressive that disagrees with us, but I think it's compatible with the Catholic tradition. My idea of democracy is not so much choosing our managers as really mostly not needing to be managed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
so that's what some people would describe as drifting towards libertarianism, correct?
Some people would say that. I am not a libertarian.
But that doesn't mean that going a certain distance in their direction is unwise.
Not going to be scared off by people saying, accusing me of moving in that direction, because
Uh,
I think that's implicit in the Catholic social principle of subsidiarity.
hmm
Uh,
Right. You really got
as
it.
much as possible, as much as possible, actions actions need to be taken by and decisions made by people at the most local level of responsibility. And the most local responsibility is me, you,
Right.
as much as possible. There's a limit to that. There does need to be coordination.
Sometimes the national defense does need to be organized,
Exactly.
or highways do need to be built.
Exactly. There's a limit to this. Yeah, but as much as possible. So again, I like the phrase, you can tell. For me, democracy is not so much choosing our managers as managing ourselves to the greatest degree possible.
Which also seems almost a way of like showing the highest dignity of a person.
I think so.
Because
Well, I think it is. You're saying something about human dignity if you say that ordinary people can be trusted to manage their lives, given a chance. And a lot of people don't have a chance. Social conditions in which they are born, economic conditions, and put those two together. Uh, it's easy to look at some people and hold them in contempt for the mess of their
mm,
lives. But usually, not 100%, but usually, better than 50%, you look at the situation, economic, social situation in which they were born. They didn't have much of a chance. So social justice means addressing in ways that themselves don't violate human dignity, addressing those economic and social conditions so that people have an opportunity to manage their lives, not to be absorbed into a collective. Oh, I hate communism. I've always hated communism.
well, it's almost like
For a while, I thought, in the 80s, for a while, I thought I needed to postpone going to seminary so that I could do my part in opposing the spread of communism in
really,
Central America. That's why I started studying Spanish.
wow.
Para combatir los sandinistas, who are back and bad in Nicaragua. Uh, collective. I want to separate as sharply as I can social justice from collectivism.
What? And go ahead, John.
And so collectivism, if you were to define it, is what precisely? I'm not sure I'm tracking what you think that
We don't
definition
have
is.
property anymore. We don't have private initiative. We have everything in common, which necessarily means we have to do what we're told to do by our superiors.
Is that like at the basis of like a Bruderhof community, for example?
No, yeah, the collectivized farming of the Soviet Union is what leaps to mind,
Okay.
and communist China as well. They stepped back from that in more recent years. Uh,
We'll see where that goes.
see where that goes. A friend of mine was in Poland, moved to Poland not long after the fall of the communist regime. There were apartment complexes that were built. The families had to share kitchens, because the theory was we have all things in common. They had to abandon this because families sharing kitchens was leading to violence.
Leads to fewer families.
Yeah, leads to fewer people. Somebody's going to get killed.
Yes.
But it's a violation of human dignity. The family has a right to a space of its own. And I don't mean out in a hermitage somewhere unconnected with others, but a certain space of its own. As the old English saying is, a man's house is his castle. I like that saying.
Hmm.
Not a castle in isolation from the rest of the world, but his place, his
Like
family's.
a castle that can rebuff any violent attack that's wrong, essentially.
Yeah,
So like welcoming to anyone that wants to come that's friendly, but
yes. You know, it's the
standing
difference.
enemies.
Exactly. It's the difference between someone coming up to you and saying, yeah, can you spare a little bit of money for me? So I cup of coffee. The difference between someone doing that and someone saying, give me some money. In the one case,
Give me your car.
that's right.
Yeah.
In the one case,
I need to get somewhere.
in the one case, you respond with generosity. In the other case, it's, well, let's see if you can take it.
Yeah.
You might not enjoy the process of trying.
Well, and I've thought about this quite a bit, and because there's also, as a side tangent of putting this in context, why I got this idea. At school, they were trying to put this idea of distributism as like a medium between capitalism and socialism. And I'm like, that's just socialism at a certain number.
It can be.
At least what they taught us.
What did they have in mind when you
Yeah.
say
No one,
distributism?
no one can make more than 10 million a year. Everything's taxed at 99% after that. I'm like, that's England. That was England. Did not work so well.
And that number could be a million, could be 5 million, could be 10 million. But like,
arbitrary, isn't it?
It's
but
very
that's
arbitrary.
but that's your objection, is that arbitrariness.
I think what the principle you should have is if you work for something and you got your major property, accumulated property from work, you should keep it if it was ethical, no matter how much it is.
I don't mind some degree of progressive taxation. However, it is true that many places damage themselves economically by pushing that too far.
Because they disincentivize their
Exactly.
best and brightest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Before Ireland revised its tax laws, a friend of mine had this experience, older friend of mine had this experience, offered some work at a good wage in Ireland before they reformed their laws. And he couldn't get takers because his wage would push them into the next tax bracket. So they were better off.
They took more home,
They took more home, getting
making
paid less.
getting paid less. Yes.
A stupid way to organize things. To me, that what you're talking about is upside down. I go back to the example of the Irish land reforms of the late 19th, early 20th century. They're the example of what Zapata tried to accomplish in Morelos. Not so much putting a cap on wealth as making sure, as sure as you can, given human frailties and then predictability of life, but making sure as much as you can that everyone has a chance at dignified labor and some actual property ownership.
I think that's it. Yeah, like if people can keep what they work for, I think that would eliminate a lot of problems. I think someone saying like, "Oh, you work too hard, you have too much. It's my responsibility, even though I've done nothing to prove my responsibility of actually knowing how hard it would be to get that money, to then take that and give it to someone else who also didn't work as
Well, and
showing responsibility to gain that."
it's usually not even as someone else. It's the bottomless coffers of the state
Yeah, exactly.
with this endless appetite for the people's resources.
So it's like, yeah, never liked that at all. Where people were like, "Oh, once you don't need any more than 10 million a year." I'm like, "Are you kidding? You know how little money that actually is? Or people they were like, oh, all government, like at least what we were being told in school, all industry should be run by the government because
Wait, sorry.
all industry.
Who was saying that in
Who was
school?
saying
Like,
This was in theology,
guess
like
the
senior year.
government
Yeah, it
but
was.
this was coming from professors, not students.
This is professors, but students bought it hook, line, and sinker. And I was trying to argue with him, like saying, look, 10 million a month, 10 million a year is not a lot of money, first off.
million doesn't go as far as it used to.
Yeah. It's like, and then to put on top of that, the only reason industry develops is because someone came up with an idea, presented it into the market accepted or rejected. If they accept and they do a good enough job of delivering a good to enough people, they can become big enough to do that for more people, commoditizing the asset so more people can buy it. That's what happened to the automobile. That's what happened to the
Yeah.
plane, electricity,
Spectacularly with computers.
computers. That's how economy works. So it's like you store your capital in a scarce asset, and yeah,
I think one has to be,
it's crazy.
we have to be able to intervene in some ways. Again, so I'm not libertarian. So, for example, and I don't have any, this goes more into your area of expertise. I don't have any solutions for this, but there's a problem when working people can't afford housing.
Well, that's a great example. So that is
What
where,
can we do about that? I don't claim to have an answer, but from my understanding of the Catholic social justice tradition is, and the American tradition, is to encourage home ownership and not discourage it.
yeah. Well, if we got rid of, well, yeah, I mean, before 1913, we didn't have a property tax. So we could get rid of that. That'd be great. Because then you're essentially just renting your property from the government, however long you have it. And then, but yeah, so this is actually where Bitcoin comes in.
Oh,
Wait, hold on. Before we get into that,
Sorry.
that's right.
I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying that when you were in college, you were being taught that profits were a negative thing for the individual past a certain level.
Yep.
And so it was
Hmm.
the duty of government to decide that
What that level is.
what that level is.
Yep.
And if you had more than that level, it was the duty of government to take it away from you and give it to
Whatever they do.
whatever they deemed important.
Yep.
So the argument was that wealth needs to ultimately be managed by the government. And why were you finding your classmates in agreement?
Because they looked at what they think capitalism is and says this is evil.
Because of like the Industrial Revolution or because of like huge corporations like Amazon or
They say, yeah.
Google or Walmart, like, oh, these economic powerhouses are destroying Main Street. So therefore we need someone bigger to step in and prevent and or redistribute the wealth. And somehow the thought there was then Main Street would like small businesses, small land holdings, people being able to have some resources of their own.
Hmm.
So it sounds like your classmates were responding to a similar sense of injustice that some have so much and so many have so little. But they thought the solution was to have government manage it
Yeah, exactly.
and to take it away from if you had a lot, the government needed to step in. So it really was this desire to have an adult in the room
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, but then the
saying
thing
like, you've
is,
had enough time with the toys, share with your brothers and sisters.
The
right.
adult is not without self-interest.
The adult's not without self-interest.
One historian surveying chaos, in some ways, highly
Yeah.
productive chaos, let it be said. But one historian surveying the chaos of 19th century American economic development And when I say chaos, it included a great deal of dishonesty, sort of habitual corruption in government and in business. One historian surveying that said it's really difficult to say whether it is business that corrupted government or government that corrupted business.
Mm.
Uh, because government had the ability to pick the winners, the economic winners and losers, uh, which made, how should I put this? It made government worth bribing, worth purchasing. Um,
because the government could introduce legislation that broke up industries
yeah, or that
or let them
rewarded,
alone.
or that provided, in the 19th century context, that provided a sweet deal for building this railroad,
Hmm.
so that you are going to be wealthy with this particular railroad, but that denies him
Mm.
such a sweet deal for building his railroad.
Hmm.
So the problem with the thinking of the government as an impartial referee is that, of course, it isn't. Uh, it has, not only does government considered abstractly have its own interests, which are not necessarily identical with those of the people, but the phrase government covers a huge number of individual actors. And these individual actors have their own interests. Uh, and those interact with the interests of business in ways that can be corrupting to business and to government. Uh, so obviously, they need to interact with each other, but the notion that government is going to be the purifying, the purifying agent seems
Well,
staggeringly naive to me.
I think that's the thing. I think what the problem is that people think, oh, this player got too good at the game. So like they are too good at figuring out the rules and they're getting everything out. So the communist idea is like eliminate that player from the game. Rather, what the capitalist idea really is like let as many people play the game as possible.
Right.
Because
Hence,
then that
yeah,
guy may have to get either really, really
the
good.
need, as you end the 19th century, move into the 20th century,
Yeah.
the need for government action against monopolies and trusts.
And the best way is deregulation because then more people can play the game.
You don't have more people playing.
Because that's what happened to the auto industry. Because we had like 3,000 automakers in the US before the EPA started. It was crazy. We had so many. It was incredible. And the EPA started, put all these regulations on what a
I
car
do
had to
have,
do.
I do have
And
kind
now
of,
we have like five.
I strong feeling you remember, you've read about this, the banking crisis and the government bailout of certain banks because they're too big to fail. And my response to that was to think, if they're too big to fail, they're too big to tolerate.
Well, if they're too big to fail, why don't they prove it? By not
Yeah.
bloody failing. No, it was a different sense of too big, as in the disaster will be too intolerable if they're allowed to fail
And if they're that big, though, they need to be broken up. We cannot allow ourselves to be that dependent on
upon,
one bank or one corporation.
or yeah, in this case, six, but
Or
yeah,
six,
yeah.
more players.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's like you start looking at how everything is owned. It's like it's just a few people own it all. And it's like,
So that's where left and a certain brand of left and a certain kind of right can make common ground.
yeah,
The agreement that concentration, excessive concentration of wealth is dangerous. But what's overlooked is entrusting to the government, entrusting it to the government is excessive concentration of wealth and power.
that's
So, I mean, how is what we're saying really different from what this uh, teacher was trying to say to you in class, which is we shouldn't allow any individual to get too big? I mean, it
right.
sounds like we're asking for the same thing, which is some measure to prevent
No,
excessive growth.
but not assigning an arbitrary number,
Hmm.
I'm
but
just,
just saying we cannot tolerate monopolies
Mm-hmm.
and trusts, monopolies and cartels. There has to be open competition
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it may be necessary, yes, sometimes it may be necessary to break up excessive concentration.
So we're not saying that, oh, it's not, you're not allowed to make so much. You're not allowed to make,
As you can.
you're
You
right.
don't want one person controlling 75% of, or one
We don't know, we
corporation.
are not opposed to you making a profit. We're opposed to you preventing anybody else from making a profit.
That's a good way of saying it, yeah.
Yeah, that puts it very well.
Because I think what they were thinking was like, well, they
That
thought,
puts it very well.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, they were essentially saying that they think no one with a lot of money can use money well, was their starting assumption. So they were like, if you
It's a
have,
dangerous assumption.
it is dangerous because that's saying when you have the power of responsibility, you're not going to use it well, so you should never have it. So it's kind of like saying you can't play with dangerous toys because you don't know if you're going to mess up.
Right.
Like,
We don't know if you're going to mess up.
exactly. It's the preventative, it's like protecting someone so much you kill them because it's like, you're smothering them to death, It's like
Hmm.
they're safe from everything else except that constant cuddling. So, so that was like their starting point. It was like, oh, people with this much money, they don't know how to handle it. I'm like, okay, that's a bad assumption.
And what were they looking at? People like buying yachts and sports cars and drugs
You
and
watch too many episodes of Kardashians.
like is that what was offensive to them? Like, oh, this wealth is leading to godless living,
I think that was their starting point.
which is gonna happen.
And the thing is, it's like,
Vegas is always going to exist.
but the
In one
thing,
form or another.
Yeah.
and then we actually read about the stories of the actually wealthy people that got there. They're like the least worldly people. They're the like most disciplined, the most thoughtful of like
Well,
these are
the
actually good
least,
rich people.
if maybe not the least worldly, but they didn't become wealthy by being self-indulgent.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
They had to have a certain discipline to be
Mm.
successful, which is why it's proverbial when a family gets wealthy in one generation, by the time you move three generations down,
He's lost it all.
they've lost an awful lot of it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the self-discipline that enables a smart person with some luck to become wealthy may not be imitated by the next generation.
Yeah.
There's this anecdote floating around somewhere on the internet of some Arab sheik explaining to a reporter that my grandfather rode a camel, my father drove in a nice sedan, I fly in a private jet, my son will fly on a private jet, but I think my grandson will probably ride a camel. So,
Very good. Poor old Leo X, House of Medici.
hmm.
He was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was so busy being a cultural figure that he did not pay proper attention to the bank that brought the family to power.
That brought the Medicis to
That brought the
power.
Medici to power.
Hmm.
So the next generation, although one member of the next generation, well, actually two members of the next generation became Pope, Leo X and Clement VII, the family bank collapsed.
Hmm.
Uh, Here is the difference, I think, or part of the difference between, how should I put this? Marshal my thoughts. I make an argument for the moral superiority of capitalism over socialism, despite the apparent philanthropy of socialism. I think it's a self-indulgent philanthropy. In other words, not I am giving because I am moved by charity, but those who have the power are going to decide that everyone will give. This is not charity, and this is not a highly moral position. This is power. Capitalism, at its best, uh, gives scope for individual talent and hard work uh, to have wide scope for action.
Hmm.
Uh, And along with that talent and hard work, it gives room for an appeal to charity, as opposed to law. I go back to what I said before, the difference between someone saying, hey, can you give me money for some coffee versus give me some money for some coffee. There's all the moral difference in the world. The coffee is still the same, but there's a huge moral difference between the appeal to charity and the appeal to force. At its best, capitalism provides room for charity, room for individual talent and hard work to have effect, full effect, and then room for the fruits of that talent and hard work to be given to charity. Some people have mocked the late medieval Italian businessmen, the world of the 15th century. They've mocked them for having the motto for God and for profit, or for having in their bookkeeping ledgers an item for their donations to charity, and yet donations are made for charity. And there was considerable room for charitable bequests, sometimes on a quite large scale. From its origins, which are medieval, some people would say it's paradoxical, but I think the early Franciscans were in some ways close allies of capitalism, rather than opponents, because they gave opportunities for people other than the old nobility to practice generosity. Now, the new capitalist class has a chance to give to the poor and to support the church, not just the grand gestures of the nobles of the past.
Because money was shifting towards something more exchangeable and
It
portable.
was shifting to money.
Yes, it was shifting to coinage.
From land to coinage.
Okay.
And
what sparked that
by
off?
eschewing land, the friars insisted they weren't going to own land. By eschewing land ownership, the friars made themselves dependent on the donations of those who had cash. And that was more the new businessmen, especially in Italy, the new businessmen of the towns.
Mm-hmm. Of which the Medicis were some of the best, or were they also nobility?
No, they became nobility. Yeah, that's always the case. If your family is wealthy for long enough, it's old money.
Okay.
Yeah, so my rough and ready summary of lots of exceptions to this is what's a rough and ready summary of the history of northern Italy, northern central Italy, those medieval centuries. 10th century ruled by imperial counts, 11th century ruled by imperial bishops, 12th century ruled by aristocratic communes, 13th century ruled by democratic communes, 14th century ruled by city bosses, 15th century ruled by city princes, as the bosses became accepted as totally legit. The democratic regime communes faltered because they couldn't provide basic law and order. But what they did provide, they rose simultaneously with the birth of capitalism. The ability of talent and intelligence to produce profit, and profit that benefited the whole community. It did not benefit the whole community without tensions, right? And it was not always just in its deployment, in its use, or its acquisition, but it was a much freer world than what went before. And I think at its best, that's the strength of capitalism, its freedom, which is not just a freedom to make money, but also freedom to use it for your community. capitalism is capable of being lifted up morally. It's also capable of being degraded morally. But I strongly object to, and I've been fighting this for 40 years, since I was a college student. I strongly object to the notion that it is inherently immoral. Strongly object to that. Indeed, I argue it's morally superior to various forms of socialism because it makes possible an appeal to charity versus an appeal to force. The difference between the opportunity to give and the requirement to give.
Yeah.
So do you think in a certain way there's actually people who are quite fervent Christians who, without meaning to, actually drift towards a really socialist outlook
Oh, yes.
of like,
Oh, yes.
you should be tithing, and then
But you should be.
once you're tithing, then you should be giving more, and then you should only take what you need and anything else belongs to the poor. People who say things along these lines.
Yes. They haven't, for the most part, haven't thought through too carefully the implications. But yes, they are moving from, not quite realizing it, they're moving from giving room for charity to force and law.
Because
You have
it's
to have some law, but law is no substitute for charity.
even though it has to be a player. It has to have
It has
it
to be a player.
has to have its seat at the table.
It does. But law cannot make all things new.
But it's that constant temptation when when we see the chaos of human existence and we see the problem of original sin. There's the constant temptation to say, let us have some strong force fix it,
Yes. And I and my friends have the wisdom to be that strong force.
instead of the constant challenging and it's return to the to discipleship of Jesus Christ.
Yes. And that nobody has the wisdom to be that strong force.
Mm.
And
Oh, that's not good to hear.
nobody has that kind of wisdom. Nobody on this earth has the ability, has the wisdom, and the depth of knowledge uh, to organize an entirely just society. And the effort to do so breaks people. It is far better, instead of attempting to oppose a right order from above, far better. Again, it goes to my definition of democracy. Not so much a matter of choosing the managers as a matter of not being managed. To the greatest degree possible, let the people manage their affairs.
Hmm.
There's some scope
Yeah.
for government intervention and action for social justice in terms of opportunity, providing as broadly as you can opportunity for ordinary people to have productive work, to own property, and to manage their affairs.
I think it's,
And
yeah.
accept the chaos of that. Accept the chaos of that as productive of better results in the long run than attempting to impose a preconceived order from above.
I was listening to
Yeah.
Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. They were on a couple weeks ago, and Peterson was talking about how tyranny is the elevation of one particular good above all others,
It's not
and
bad.
then um, a forced cooperation for that one goal at the expense of everything else.
One of Chesterton's key insights is that nothing causes as much damage, no vice causes as much damage as a virtue run amok. That is to say, a
Mm.
virtue that is cut off from the other virtues.
Wow.
Um, so that you have, to take an obvious example, justice without mercy. And you can easily imagine how justice without mercy produces terrible results. Sincere commitment to justice, but you're breaking people along the way. How about mercy without justice? Terribly sincere, but you're also breaking people along the way. You are not punishing crime. Therefore, you're allowing crime to flourish. And crime flourishes while you smile benevolently, congratulating yourself for being the merciful one.
Well, all the victims of those crimes are crying out for some justice.
For justice. Virtues come as a package. You don't have a true, this is old wisdom. It should be old wisdom. What are the cardinal virtues? Prudence, justice, courage, fortitude, and prudence, justice, right? Courage and
Fortitude, right?
fortitude. No,
Okay.
no, that's courage.
Oh, that is part of courage. Oh,
What if someone is imprudent?
they can't govern.
They can't govern. They can't truly be a good person. Temperance is the one I was fishing for.
Ah,
Temperance, self-control. The person might be full of goodwill, but has no self-control, can't be a good person. Someone without justice, more obviously. What good does their self-control do if they have no will to be just? So the virtues come as a package. And if you don't have one, if you're missing one virtue, you don't have a good person.
yeah. That's always why it's a little unsatisfying when people be like, well, his heart's in the right place. Yeah, yeah. But but he left 12 children at another school in another county.
Right.
He needs to count the heads on the bus. But his heart's in the right place. Well, the children aren't in the right place.
His heart is in the right place. And
He has no ill will.
right. Exactly. So lacks perhaps self-control or lacks real commitment to justice. Possibly lacks prudence. So the virtues come as a package.
I really like that.
And one of them elevated above the others becomes monstrous. The novel, and even more blatantly, even somewhat crudely, the musical Les Miserables, really drive home what justice does, what harm justice does when it's divorced from other virtues. Harder. But I think if I may touch on recent politics, I think part of the misery on our borders and part of the misery in some of our cities is a result of what happens when mercy gets disconnected from other virtues and is allowed to run amok.
And if people protest, you accuse them of not being merciful enough. You're not showing mercy. Actually, there are other goods that are being sacrificed on what's become the altar of mercy.
More than one medieval king was despised and rejected by his people with good reason for his failure to be adequately just. He was too busy pardoning criminals, but ordinary people are the main victims of crime. And one of the things they most want from the government, what it really needs to do, is provide basic law and order. Individual people on their own, they can provide some security for their families, but basic law and order is a task too complex for one family at a time.
Right,
That's
right. Without turning every house into a literal fortress.
Without every house becoming literally a castle. You have to have basic law and order. You can't have basic law and order without some, how shall I put this? Without justice in the form of public force. You do have to have some of that. You can't Rule it out completely.
There has to be an element of fear,
Has to be an element of fear.
of
Someone
retribution
told
for
me-
misdeeds.
Someone told me that contemporary Lego police sets, the policemen don't have guns. They have handcuffs, but not have guns.
Hmm.
I don't know this. I haven't looked at Lego police sets. Someone told me that. I thought, well, if that's true, what a fantasy that is. Here, please let me put these on you,
Hold out your hands.
Mr. Bad Guy. Please do me the favor of holding out your hands. St. Paul says the prince does not bear the sword in vain. Uh, that doesn't mean literally killing people, I don't think, but it means that public authority, you do have to have it. So I'm not a libertarian in the end.
Hmm.
Public authority must be able to step in when there is criminal behavior. My argument, what seems to me what you've noticed is some people seem to regard capitalism, seem to regard the profit motive as inherently criminal,
Right, yeah.
and I reject that. To me, it is a fundamentally healthy thing, like any other fundamentally healthy thing, such as the sexual instinct or the desire to eat. It's a fundamentally healthy thing that can become twisted,
Yeah, yeah.
can become disordered. That's the word. But in itself, it's healthy.
That I agree with you. How are we to square that with the Catholic cultural upbringing we receive, in which we read story after story and book after book of saints who gave without counting the
Oh,
cost?
well, I've been thinking about this for more than 40 years.
Good,
I have
because because we need the answer.
I'm a celibate. Right.
Hmm.
Now, the fact that I'm a celibate does not mean that I think everybody else has to be celibate.
Hmm.
As Shakespeare's Benedict said, I think it was Benedict, the world must be peopled. Uh,
Yes, and that's in Much Ado About Nothing.
much of it, yeah, I acknowledge not just that, the sexual desire is in itself a healthy thing, but it's easily disordered. Some are called to celibacy, partly virginity for the sake of the kingdom, partly as a testimony to a kingdom from beyond this world.
As in, there's something else
Exactly.
worth giving up
Exactly.
that's
And
good for.
partly as a reminder to everyone. This is why healthy celibacy is so helpful to everyone else and why failed celibacy is so deeply discouraging. As a reminder to everybody else that, in fact, the sexual desire can be disciplined.
This horse can be governed.
It can be governed. It actually can be. Imagine that. You are not helpless. So everybody is called to a certain kind of chastity. So religious celibacy is a testimony to a world to come and also a testimony that in this world, sexual desire can be controlled. Similarly, there are those who do have the call to literal poverty. Most don't. Some do. Those who have that call, it serves, I think, that a similar purpose. To bear testimony to the kingdom of heaven, and also to show that this healthy desire, but easily disordered desire for profit and for wealth, healthy but easily disordered, it can be controlled. We're all called to control it, to discipline it. We're all called to discipline it to some degree. Some are called to discipline it, are called to a lifestyle that disciplines it to a degree, such a degree that they live in literal poverty, but all are called to discipline it to the degree that they reject any illicit profit and they share their wealth generously. So that you think about. What percentage of my wealth do I give to church and charity? Let me calculate that. Oh my. I'm not even giving God a decent tip. I am not giving God's poor a decent tip. Out of all my revenue, this is all that I give. Out of all the income I make, this is all that I give. What does that say about me? Now, so that has to be asked. That's examination of conscience. So when I say that the profit motive, the desire for wealth, is not inherently evil, indeed, it's in itself healthy, but it is easily disordered.
Hmm.
It does need to be disciplined. And those in the church, those saints who have that call, are a challenge, a sign that says to everybody else, take a look at your life and see what you're doing with your wealth. How much are you spending it on parties? How much of it are you spending on parties? How much of it are you giving to help the preaching of the gospel? How much of it are you giving to help the genuinely needy? What are you doing with it?
Hmm. Hmm.
Do you think the calling part of like, um, living in extreme poverty or celibacy or out of some of the extreme things that we're shown examples of, do you think the reason some people are called to that is because if they follow that path, that's in what that path will allow them to become most like the person God made them to be?
Oh, yes.
So maybe it's like maybe the person that God made you to be shouldn't have the path that these other people had, because maybe there's something about you that wouldn't align with that well.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, to go with the example of celibacy, if you are called to marriage, you will be miserable as a celibate.
Hmm.
You won't even really be married.
What's that?
You wouldn't even really be married.
If you're called, what am I saying? If you're called to marriage, you'd be
Oh,
miserable.
sorry, sorry.
Right,
I thought you meant like if you got married and then tried to live as a complete celibate.
right,
Oh,
You know what you're talking about is if you were called to one thing, but
right,
then went in the other direction. Okay.
You're not
I
being
misunderstood your terms.
you're not being true to yourself.
Hmm.
You're mistaking your true self. And I think it's similar with poverty.
hmm.
Um, I do think I am quite convinced of this. There is a legitimate call to be a wealthy Christian.
Hmm.
There's a place for that. Always has been, always will be. These are the people who supported the Lord Jesus in his earthly ministry. These are the people who supported the preaching of the early apostles. By the time we move into the later Middle Ages, these are the nobles in the earlier Middle Ages who gave generously to the establishment of cathedrals and monasteries, or the businessmen of the later Middle Ages who helped in the work of the friars and the founding of hospitals and the founding of schools. I think it's a quite specific call and a beautiful call. The profit motive can be holy. Now, that's putting it strongly. But it can be holy when it is joined to faith, hope, and charity. And that when it is put at the service of faith, hope, and charity. It's like that old worker said to my dad, I never got a job from somebody who didn't have money. Uh, the work of faith, hope, and charity, to some degree, depends on people who have money.
Is that going to be the title of this episode? Holy Prophets?
Holy prophets, there's the thing. I don't object to those. Some people think it was awfully funny that some late medieval businessmen could talk about for God and for profit, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Hmm.
That said, profit, the desire for profit, the drive for profit, like the sexual drive, is easily disordered.
Right.
And
What desire do we have that's not easily disordered?
not a one. Any of our desires that is not from God is easily disordered. Well, they're ultimately from God. They're all easily disordered even the religious motive can be disordered.
Mm.
It can be twisted into fanaticism. There's not a single drive of ours that can't be disordered. Part of ordering them is keeping them all in balance with each other.
Mm.
So the religious person does not become a fanatic because that person sees more than the immediately everything is ultimately religious, I think, because it comes from God and leads to God. But the fanatic makes the immediately religious the only thing worthy of attention.
Yes.
And that's a disorder.
The immediately and obviously religious.
Exactly.
Yes. I remember a friend telling me about
That's
it.
possible at parties.
Well, and I remember a friend telling me that her brother had gone to a boys' boarding school where one of the chaplains was convinced that teenage boys needed to spend as much time in the chapel as they did playing sports. Down to like we needed to measure the minutes,
Ah!
right? Like 60-minute football game, 60 minutes in the
Well,
chapel.
that's just annoying.
20 minutes, 20-minute recess, 20 minutes in the chapel.
There's not totally wrong. There's a balance.
Yep. But I think the underlying assumption was being in the chapel is the only thing worthwhile, and everything else is simply a accommodation
And
for
that's
for
wrong.
other things.
That's wrong. I think of St. Louis the Ninth of France.
Mm-hmm.
St. Louis the Ninth.
Saint Louis the Ninth.
Once he accepted it as his vocation.
Mm-hmm.
By his birth order, he was to be king. He spent a lot of time in chapel. St. Louis the Ninth spent a lot of time at prayer. But his vocation was to be king, a Christian king, but he always did his job as king.
Hmm.
At one point, he had to tell his devout relative, Henry III of England, who was having a wonderful time visiting him in Paris. At one point, Louis IX had to say to him, really quite charitably, it wasn't just an excuse for getting rid of him, because Louis liked Henry, and Henry liked Louis. But he had to say to him, you are King of England.
You need to
And
go home.
you need to go home and, and be king in England. It's your job. It's your vocation.
Hmm.
Francis de Sales, in his introduction to the devout life, he talks about how maybe the classic for lay spirituality. He talks about how absurd it is to think that the spirituality of a monk can be the spirituality of a courtier or a soldier or a merchant. Yet everyone can have a devout life. But it has to be a devout life for your state in life.
Hmm.
So you're going to be a very devout teenager, very devout teenage boy, but devout as a teenage boy, which means you can't spend all your time in chapel.
Well, it also means that at that particular moment in life, your body needs a lot of
It
exercise.
needs a lot of exercise.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a fundamental error. St. Francis de Sales would have chastised him. But again, balance.
Balance. Maybe that's what we'll call the episode.
Balance.
Balance.
Profit has its place in the balance. There's a reason why the church had to condemn as a heresy the notion that Christians are not to own property. Some of the most extreme Franciscans of the late 13th, early 14th century fell into that heresy. And the church even said we cannot even assert that Jesus owned no property. We know what kind of lifestyle he had. It was not a wealthy lifestyle. We know that he had no permanent home. We also know that he and the apostles did have a common purse. We don't know exactly what their financial arrangements were, but be careful not to make an idol out of poverty. Goes back to the idea of all the virtues go together. Don't make an idol out of poverty.
Hmm.
Don't make a demon out of wealth.
It's a more common temptation to idolize wealth. But for certain people,
Easily.
but for certain people, it could be just as strong a temptation to make an idol out of poverty.
Yes.
Right. It's just that's probably like 5% of the population and 95% of the population go the other way. But for both sides, there's an equally strong temptation.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Poverty and wealth have their place. That sounds odd for poverty to have its place. But again, I talked about those who have that calling to literal poverty.
Hmm.
It's a way of testifying to the kingdom of heaven and to trust in divine providence. And all of us have to have some trust in divine providence and not try to build up such wealth that we'll have complete absolute security. Uh, all of us have to be able to acknowledge the limitations of wealth. All of us have to be willing to share the wealth we have and do it generously.
Hmm.
It's proverbial. The Lord talked about it in the parable of the widow's mite, and modern statistics bear that out. Uh, the poor do give a higher percentage of their wealth away. So it does seem that most, not all, it does seem that most people, as they gain wealth, they get pretty tenacious about keeping it.
Well, in their defense, you might ask them how much effort it took to get their hands on it in the first place.
You can ask them that, but you can also ask, how are you using it?
Hmm.
Because it is a tool. Not bad, not bad. But what are you doing with that tool?
Hmm.
And to what extent are you using that tool for your community? And that circles back to, for me, it's not so much how much wealth someone has, how much money they have, but do they have a home? Do they have a community that is their community into which they put some of their wealth? Or are they above? Have they adopted a lifestyle that puts them above everybody else and not connected to any particular community?
Yeah.
Read about ancient medieval cities. One of the things I admire about ancient medieval cities is that by and large, kind of a generalization, right? But by and large, you didn't really have wealthy neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. So the wealthy were more cheek by jowl. The
Hmm.
wealthy and the poor were more cheek by jowl,
You bumped elbows with
bumping
people,
elbows with each other.
people of every
Yeah,
social tier.
yes.
Hmm.
Today there's less deference given to the socially prominent, but there's also less contact
Hmm.
between the wealthy and the poor.
Hmm.
So for me, it's not so much how much wealth, it's not so much my difficulties are not with a number, how much wealth people have, but how connected are they with everybody else?
Hmm. And the connections probably would encourage the generosity that you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right. Rather than be like, you are a wealthy man, so you're required to give this much. It's actually, it, many times, not every time. There's always going to be the Scrooges.
They do exist.
They do exist, but the connectivity with other people is the best natural encouragement of the sort of generosity that we're hoping for.
Easily.
Right. Again, it's not a guarantee.
As the Lord indicated in the story of Lazarus and the rich man,
Hmm.
he could see Lazarus right outside his gate.
Yes.
But generally, yes. So it's that rootedness. That's more my concern and more of my hesitation about a hesitation is not the word, my distaste for a class of globalized rich who call no place home.
Hmm.
Build bunkers and islands. So
Yeah,
heard about those?
yeah, only a little bit, but I find the idea profoundly distasteful.
Heard about it?
Not explicitly. Yeah.
There's this thing where all the rich people are building these underground, like end of world bunkers.
Hmm.
Just in, I don't know where all that they're happening, but an average one costs about 120 million.
Okay, so it's stocked with food and
It's like a mini
living
city.
quarters and fire suppression and water desalinization and yeah, ways to get to and fro. And it's okay.
If
It's
you
meant
put
to
a yacht underground
mm-hmm.
that was impervious to problems, that's what it would be.
Hmm. Interesting. Well,
That's
there's someone feeding his family by building these things, right?
that's worth recalling.
Well, and the thing is too, like they still gonna call the plumber and the electrician when stuff goes out, so they're not like totally disconnected.
They can't be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an
They
old
got one on
argument.
staff.
When the Bishop of Paris, with support from the king and from the city of Paris, was building Notre Dame Cathedral. Yeah, Bishop de Sully, Henri de Sully. There were those who said that the money being spent in the cathedral could be given to the poor. And Bishop de Sully, he made the remarkably modern argument, but it's a striking argument. There's something better than giving them a handout. How many people are getting work
Hmm.
through building this cathedral?
And how many lives will be changed by people that walk into that
Well,
cathedral?
and then, yes, you consider I just had something to think about. Bishop de Sully, if he's in heaven, must be very, 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 very pleased that the building he built could attract the attention of the whole world hundreds of years later, and that its burning and rebuilding could become a global drama. Uh,
Hmm.
Such a drama that the president elect of the United States would want to be there for the rededication.
Yeah, I cried when that fire happened.
I did too.
Yeah.
So, talk about a success. Again, the balance. You do need to care for the poor, but that doesn't mean you can't have beautiful buildings. You have to
Yeah.
care for the poor. That doesn't mean you can't have some parties. I sometimes grumble that we don't have enough public parties. Uh, the medievals used to be, medievals again, the coronation of a coronation of a new king of England. The the main fountains of London would run with wine instead of water for the occasion, so that the whole population could join in the feast, and there'd be food deployed along the main streets. Public festival, hugely expensive, of course, the public festival.
Hmm. But something worth spending money on.
Remember my age, celebration of the 200th anniversary of the United States Constitution, 1987. Big fireworks display in New York. And the usual suspects. God, that's so on my nerves. Oh, with all the things going on in the world that need our attention, we're going to spend money on fireworks. Blast it! 200 years of a constitution. This is something worth celebrating.
Yeah.
And 200 years of stable government. So let's have a party and just for 24 hours, stop bitching and moaning. Just for 24 hours. Do you think you can do that?
No. Well, that's how they make their money.
That's how they make their money.
They are professional nags.
Yeah, there is such a thing. Again, balance. That would be a good name for the episode. You do need to pay attention to the world's problems, but you also sometimes need to have a party.
Hmm.
You need to be able to relax. You need to be able to celebrate. Some things are worth celebrating. Every family has the uncle who decides to bring up disasters at Thanksgiving dinner. This is a very unfortunate way to live.
Yeah.
Try Thanksgiving dinner. The disaster will still be there tomorrow.
And the disaster will be not getting into Black Friday in time for the savings.
You don't ignore the disaster.
Yeah.
Don't ignore it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you don't have Thanksgiving dinner and enjoy it.
Yeah.
And it's almost paradoxical that when you celebrate a disaster more than, let's say, the party, you're raising this evil thing above what's good.
That's
right now.
very true.
Yeah.
Very true. I think I annoyed some people years ago speaking at a Holocaust observance, but I got so tired of the standard speeches at these events that I decided, one thing I'm going to say, we should remember and celebrate the fact that the Nazis lost.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And they lost comprehensively. Particularly, they sought to annihilate the Jewish people, and yet here they are. They failed. And there were people in that, some years ago, there were people in that particular audience who were survivors of the Holocaust. These occasions, the tragedy, the pain, and the horror need to be remembered, but they can be gruesomely lugubrious. Remember also, they failed. That's worth noting, and that's worth celebrating. Don't fail to celebrate that, because what you said, you can actually give the devil more than his due if you pay too much attention, place too much emphasis on the horror and the crime, and not enough attention, and don't pay enough attention to heroism, to nobility, and to victory.
Mm.
Never forget that we won.
Yeah, like one last thing. When some of well, now my sister-in-law, her friends were over here from Austria, and they couldn't believe how much we loved our country on July 4th. They're like, "You people are crazy," and we're like, "Crazy? Fought hard for this."
Right. The best day of the year.
It goes back to the importance of having a home and a homeland. Always balance that desire for a home and a homeland. That loyalty to your homeland can also be disordered, as can the sexual drive, the profit motive, religion itself.
Yeah.
It can be disordered, but the fact that it can be disordered doesn't mean that it's healthy to try and suppress it. In fact, it's quite foolish to try and suppress it. You open the way to, you open wide the door to selfishness if you don't root people in a community and a land. That Walter Scott line, I'm going to quote it again, that they made me learn in grade school, and I'm glad they did. Lives there a man with soul so dead that never to himself hath said, "This is my own, my native land." Have a land, a native land, and love it, and maybe you immigrate, then adopt that new land. But love it. Live in it. Live somewhere. Travel some, but have a home and build that home. Share that home with other people. Put some of your wealth into building up that home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Father, we are out of time.
We are out of time.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming back.
Yeah.
Bourbon, thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure to have you.